Spooky season, spooky season, spooky, spooky, spooky season. Hello, my hair is a mess, but I don't care because it's October, so spooky season has arrived. That was a very obnoxious opening, I'm sorry. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Joan, and today we are kicking off October and spooky season with a spooky season I need to stop saying spooky season. We are back with a Halloween special of monsters, myths and makeup, which, if you didn't know, is a little series that I have where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths, whilst I attempt to bring these stories to life through a creature inspired behind the legends. Inspired behind? Makeup look inspired by a creature behind the legends. I'm just really excited to get started, so I'm stumbling. If you are interested in mythology and or makeup, I would recommend hitting subscribe because that basically covers a lot of what I do. If you're already subscribed, thank you. Please feel free to hit like if you enjoy the video. Now, obviously October is finally here. I have already started posting just a crazy amount of content because Halloween is my jam. So just like last year, I will be doing special episodes of Monsters, Myths and Makeup every week for the entirety of October. Now, last year I tended to focus on like myths and creatures or folklore that was kind of more specifically related to Halloween. This year I wanted to do a bit more of a mix of like some classic monstrous creatures, a couple of horrifying myths, and some good old-fashioned hauntings, which is actually where we're going to start this week. But, as I'm sure you will have seen in the title and the thumbnail, we are looking at a very specific series of hauntings, and that is the real-life cases that inspired the Conjuring films. Now, there is a reason for this oddly specific sort of tangent into folklore, urban legend, that kind of thing. So the final installment of the Conjuring franchise, The Conjuring Last Rites, was released at the beginning of September. And I was very fortunate enough that Warner Bros. Actually invited me to an early screening of the film, followed by the opportunity to experience their occult museum show in London. All of which was just insanely fun and genuinely quite scary because the occult museum, they had like scare actors and it was a whole big thing. But it got me so hyped up just about the entire franchise, and especially because it's all based on true stories. I am even repping some of the merch that I got from my little day out. Although, I have to give credit to whoever came up with this concept for like the poster and the design, because this, one of the coolest, like, I love it so much. It's so clever. Now, any of you who remember from last year, or the compilation video I put up like a few days ago, I looked into the real life story of the infamous Annabelle doll. It was part of an episode that I did on like haunted dolls in general last October. So I thought it could be quite fun to look at some of the other real life cases that went on to inspire the films within the Conjuring universe, all of which were investigated by the equally infamous Ed and Lorraine Warren. From the Perron family in Rhode Island, to the terrifying Enfield poltergeist all the way in London, to the Smurl family in Pennsylvania. These are the real-life cases that turned this husband and wife duo into household names. And because this is Halloween season, we are also going to be talking about whether or not the films themselves were haunted. Because, spoiler alert, quite a lot of people think they were. But before we get too far into the demonology rabbit hole, let me go get prepped, ready and set up. So, grab a Red Bull, grab a Monster, grab a seat, and let's go. I don't know why I keep doing this with my hands. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave links to all the products that I use in the description box down below. Now, before we get stuck into all the case files, let's set the stage a little bit. So, who exactly were Ed and Lorraine Warren? Most people will have probably heard of them by now, with a majority of that being a result of the Conjuring franchise. So Ed Warren was born in 1926 in Bridgeport in Connecticut. He grew up in a Catholic household, and he later said that he experienced a lot of like ghostly phenomena as a child. He served in the US Navy during World War II, after which he was discharged, and he then became like a house and sign painter. But demonology and the paranormal was a bit of a lifelong obsession for him. This looks like I'm about to start shaving. Now, Lorraine was born a year later in 1927, also in Connecticut, and she described herself as a light trance medium and like clairvoyant, stating that her psychic abilities began in childhood when she started to see like auras around people. Together, the couple married fairly young in 1945, and they started out by investigating like local haunted houses in New England. They would go around mainly based off like word of mouth, but obviously because at this point they weren't exactly known to anyone, they needed not necessarily a ruse, but they needed a way in to these houses in the first place. So the way they went around this is that in those early days, Ed would sketch or paint an image of this allegedly haunted house, and that was their kind of way in. They'd knock on the door, show his paintings to the homeowners, and sort of strike up a conversation about strange experiences, things that were happening, until it slowly began to evolve into these like full-blown investigations. In 1952, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, which they called the oldest ghost hunting group in New England. I'm not exactly sure like at what point they started referring to it as the oldest ghost hunting group, because surely you can't call it that like immediately after you founded it. I don't know if that was like a title that they gave to it sort of later on down the line, but this group, and in particular Ed and Lorraine themselves, worked very closely with the clergy, and especially like Catholic priests, and they framed almost all of the hauntings that they investigated as the work of like inhuman spirits, aka demons. The Warrens weren't just like paranormal investigators or demon hunters, whatever title you want to give them. They were essentially also storytellers, because they delivered a series of lectures at university campuses during like the 60s and 70s, often showing various slides and artifacts and evidence from these alleged hauntings. I'm going to say alleged a lot and do a lot of these because obviously a lot of it is based purely on just Ed and Lorraine's word. I haven't made my mind up on how I feel about it, so there's going to be a lot of air quotes for the moment. Obviously, anyone who does already know the story of Ed and Lorraine Warren, sound off in the comments as to whether you believe them or just generally what you think, because it is a controversial topic. Man, I look insane right now. Now, their storytelling ability wasn't just limited to these lectures around various campuses, because they also co-wrote over 10 books together, and their home eventually became almost like a bit of a tourist trap, because it was the Warrens' occult museum, which was absolutely filled with various items and artifacts that the Warrens had claimed were haunted or cursed, and this included the infamous Annabelle doll, which, weird little side note, the also fairly infamous comedian Matt Rife now actually owns said home and accompanying occult museum, making him the official legal guardian of the Annabelle doll, which anyone in like the beauty community especially will probably have certain opinions on him. I don't think I need to necessarily say anything about him, but it is just a weird little fact that he now owns that house, museum and doll. Because obviously, again, slight tangent, even following my video from last year where I looked at Annabelle and her various shenanigans, she has gone on to cause further shenanigans, or well, people have associated her with things that have happened since then, because I believe they took the doll on like a tour around the US, because obviously it's a very famous doll, people like to go and see it, same as like Robert the doll. But I know one particular example is I think they took her to like an old plantation house, and then not long after she visited that house it mysteriously burnt down, which I'm not saying that Annabelle did it, but anyway, going back to the Warrens, this combination of like Catholic demonology, dramatic storytelling, and like physical artifacts, it made the Warrens quite unique in the realm of the paranormal. Now, whether you believe in their work and their stories, or whether you think, like a lot of people do, that they were not necessarily full-on frauds, but certainly over-exaggerated certain aspects of the tales, or, to be fair, there are people who do think they were just straight-up con artists. But either way, the cases that they investigated in became sort of modern folklore, essentially, and it fed into both the like tabloid presses of the 70s, and then decades later, things like the Conjuring films. And speaking of said films, this leads us to our first big case, which was the Perron family of Harrisville, Rhode Island. The timeline for this starts in 1971 when Carolyn and Roger Perron move into this enormous 14-room farmhouse that was built in like the 1700s along with their 5 daughters. Now, almost immediately after moving in, the daughters begin noticing sort of strange occurrences. Brooms going missing, small piles of dirt appearing on floors that had like just been cleaned, beds shaking, generally lots of stuff that you could potentially explain away quite easily on their own, but when it kind of all happens continuously at the same time, it becomes a bit harder to ignore. Especially because it didn't take long for these occurrences to actually start escalating, and the girls started reporting that they were seeing like apparitions of different figures. And these apparitions ranged from like a harmless sort of elderly woman dressed in grey through to this terrifying, malevolent female spirit that apparently threatened them. Carolyn herself said that she was actually attacked at least once, being essentially like stabbed by something she couldn't see with like a knitting needle, I think. The Warrens had become involved in the case after word had spread about what was happening within the house, and upon visiting and speaking with the family, they then concluded that the house is actually haunted by multiple spirits. The most notorious of these spirits being the spirit of a woman called Bathsheba Sherman. I've got no idea if that's how it's pronounced. It's an odd name. Now, Bathsheba was actually a real woman who lived in sort of the mid-1800s near the property. The area had a bit of its own sort of like folklore and legend tied into her, in that she was believed to have been accused of witchcraft after a child mysteriously died under her care. And there are some versions where it's claimed it was actually her own son, and that it was part of a sacrifice that she had made to the devil. Although there are no trial records that exist of her ever being accused of witchcraft or anything to do with a child's death. Now, the Warrens claimed that Bathsheba had hung herself on the property and essentially cursed it, that anyone who lived there would somehow suffer from some terrible death. So, fairly classic ghost haunting kind of thing. Now, Andrea Perron, who was the oldest daughter, later wrote a trilogy of books called The House of Darkness, House of Light. And she insists that, obviously, whilst every detail included within the Conjuring film wasn't necessarily accurate, much of what her family experienced was real. Doors banging on their own, the smell of rotting flesh permeating through the house, beds shaking violently at night, all of that kind of thing. Following the involvement and investigation of the Warrens, the Perrons actually remained within that house for about another decade, and they then left in sort of 1980, but they reported that they still experienced various different disturbances until they moved. The later owners of the property denied ever experiencing anything unusual, which, if you look into any kind of classic haunting cases, is generally the case for what happens with haunted houses especially. Now, the Conjuring film obviously dramatizes it into a bit more of a sort of classic exorcism story, with Lorraine Warren being the kind of central force in driving away this demonic spirit. In real life, however, the Warrens' involvement in this case was actually fairly limited, and there was no official exorcism ever performed. Carolyn herself eventually went on to state that after doing sort of a seance with the Warrens, things actually got worse, not better. So that briefly covers the events that were behind the first film. So now, let's talk about the doll again. Obviously, if you saw my previous episode on this, you'll know a lot more about the doll and its history and that kind of thing. But we're going to cover it again briefly for the context of the films and the Conjuring universe. So the story of the real Annabelle begins in 1970 with 2 nursing students, Donna and Angie. Now, they shared an apartment together in Hartford in Connecticut, and Donna's mother had bought her this really big sort of Raggedy Ann style doll as a gift. But soon after she'd received this gift, they noticed that the doll seemed to be moving around their apartment on its own. Sometimes it would be found sort of sat cross-legged on the floor, other times it would be standing upright, leaning against furniture. Obviously, all of this would happen when no one was home. Then, after that, came the infamous notes. So, pieces of parchment began to appear around their apartment with scribbled messages like "help me" on it. The creepiest aspect of that for me is the fact that the women didn't even own parchment. The doll then seems to sort of target one of the girl's boyfriends, a guy called Lou. Now, there are quite a few variations on his story and sort of his experience with the doll, some of which were that he fell asleep one day and then woke up to find the doll sitting on his chest trying to strangle him. Other cases, he woke up because he felt a really sharp pain and then realised there were claw marks going across his chest that then mysteriously disappeared after a couple of days. Others, he heard what he thought was someone trying to break in, so he went to check and he found the doll lying face down on the floor. It's a lot of fairly classic possessed item haunting stories. Again, depending on what stories you read and what sources you look at, it's kind of any of the above happened. So after this, the girls were rightfully quite terrified because the doll had evolved from just moving around to now full-on attacking people. So they called in a psychic medium to try and help them identify what was happening. Now, when they called them in, this psychic medium told them that the doll was indeed possessed, but it was possessed by the spirit of a young girl called Annabelle. Or more specifically, a young girl called Annabelle Higgins, who had allegedly died nearby. And I think the story went that her body had been discovered when they were building up this particular block of apartments. But essentially the medium explained that the spirit wasn't harmful, it was childish. It just wanted to be accepted and to be loved. So the two nurses took quite a lot of pity on this spirit. So they allowed it to remain within this doll, and they kind of did everything they could to help the child, or the spirit of this child, feel loved and safe. Now, the Warrens had some thoughts about this, and they basically said that it was a trick. There was a specific statement that they gave to do with human spirits not being able to occupy inhuman objects or something like that, but they basically explained that no child's soul would attach itself to a doll. And in their view, this entity was inhuman and, quite frankly, demonic. And it had essentially used the doll and this kind of illusion of a child's spirit as a bit of a ruse, and the doll became a conduit in order for it to gain attention and sort of acceptance before eventually then finding a human host. The Warrens then explained that the girls, whilst obviously acting in what they thought was the best way of accepting this child's spirit, they'd essentially done the opposite of what you should do in that scenario. And the only way to help them be rid of this demonic spirit was to have the apartment blessed, and the Warrens would then take the doll and remove it from their home. And so Annabelle was taken away from the two nurses and taken to the Warrens' occult museum in their home in Connecticut. There, it was locked inside a glass case with the very famous sign that read, "Positively do not open." Lorraine would actually often say that the Annabelle doll was one of the most cursed objects that they ever encountered during their work. And even just on the journey back from the nurse's apartment where they were bringing the doll to their museum, they alleged that the doll caused their car to nearly crash or veer off the road on several occasions. But again, it's one of those tales where the only witnesses were Ed and Lorraine themselves. So think of that what you will. I don't think I've ever looked better, to be honest. Now, obviously in the movies, Annabelle is portrayed as this weathered, cracked porcelain doll. So visually terrifying. There's something about the face that is just really unnerving. In real life, however, it's this brightly coloured, oversized Raggedy Ann doll, which some have argued you could consider it creepier because it looks so ordinary. Obviously, the Annabelle doll within the film universe was designed to look as creepy and terrifying as possible. And having seen the actual Annabelle doll prop that was used within the films, it is really unnerving to look at. Like I said, there is just something about the face design on it, combined with the weathered, cracked effect. It's just ugh, I say as I look like this. Now, for the next big case, we fly across the pond to England, or more specifically, to Enfield, which is in North London. And this is where we look at the very, very famous case of the Enfield poltergeist, which was the story behind The Conjuring 2. Now, the timeline for this case starts in August of 1977. Single mother Peggy Hodgson calls police to her council house in Enfield, North London, reporting strange noises, furniture moving around, all the usual haunting stuff. So police go out to check and, make sure it's not an intruder or anything like that. And the officer that went to initially investigate did witness like a chair sort of like randomly sliding across the room, obviously without anyone touching it. Now, this particular case and haunting experience carried on for like 18 months after this initial phone call, and Peggy's 4 children, in particular her 11-year-old daughter Janet, were right at the centre. Strange knocking sounds, toys flying about all over the place, beds shaking again, and one of the more famous instances were like grisly, very masculine voices coming through the 11-year-old Janet. Now, members of something called the Society for Psychical Research. I've had to double check this because my brain kept trying to read it as either psychic or physical, so I'm guessing it's like a combination of psychic and physical, but my brain can't quite read it properly. So I don't know if it's pronounced psychical, because that doesn't feel like a word. But anyway, members for this centre, and in particular Maurice Grosse and Guy Leon Playfair, they investigated this case for months. Now, this included hundreds of hours of like recorded audio, various photography, and quite famously, some of these photographs included 11-year-old Janet seemingly like levitating. And the sheer amount of like evidence that was captured as part of this investigation brought in a lot of experts to sort of witness what was happening. The voice phenomena within Janet was like a particularly famous and particularly chilling aspect of this case and this investigation, because it was this deep, gravelly voice that was coming through her, claiming to be someone called Bill Wilkins, who had actually died in that house years earlier. It was then later on confirmed that a Bill Wilkins had indeed died sitting in like a chair within that house, again, years earlier, which led quite a sort of eerie credibility to the whole case. But not everyone bought into that story, or to be fair, into the whole haunting in general. Because of how much like media attention this case in particular garnered, alongside the amount of evidence that had been like captured and recorded, the flip side of that was that there were some reporters who would claim to see the children like banging on the walls or slamming the doors. Some of the children were apparently seen like bending spoons and various different things that led some people to believe the whole thing was a bit of a hoax caused by these sort of unruly children. Janet herself, the 11-year-old who had been right at the centre of everything that was happening, eventually admitted that about 2% of sort of the events that occurred were faked as a way to try and like test the investigators, which obviously dampens some of the credibility of the case. However, essentially based on like the sheer amount of documentation of what happened, even like hardened skeptics did admit that some of the events that occurred were particularly difficult to try and explain. Now, the Warrens' involvement in this case, again, similar to the very first instance, is quite exaggerated within the film. So in the film, the Warrens are central to the whole investigation, battling the demons like front and centre in order to save the Hodgson family. In reality, their role was quite minimal, so they turned up quite briefly to the house. They turned up uninvited, and as a result, were refused entry to the house in the first place. And the case was mainly managed by the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. Playfair, one of the main investigators into the case, later criticised the film for sort of exaggerating the Warrens' involvement in it, which I can understand his perspective, because obviously he was the one who dealt with it. But in the same breath, if you've got the Warrens as like the central characters in your film, you're not going to portray them as like turning up uninvited and then being told to leave, because that's not a very good film. But interestingly, something that didn't particularly help the Warrens' reputation as being like con artists to some degree is that there were allegedly claims that Ed Warren had spoken to Playfair, one of the main investigators in the case, basically trying to persuade him that they could make a lot of money off the back of this case through writing books, selling movie rights, that kind of thing. Which, I mean, to be fair, movie rights did get sold later on. He wasn't wrong, because I don't know how many like books the Warrens had published at this point, because they did actually publish obviously quite a few of them, and they had made a very big name for themselves. But, you know, when people are questioning your credibility, maybe going in at that angle isn't the best idea. But I mean, that's just me. But there's a really interesting legacy around that case in particular. So the Enfield haunting remains one of the most documented and studied poltergeist cases ever, with hundreds of hours of audio recording, photographs, witness testimonies, and it completely divided the believers and the skeptics, and it still does to this day. I know stories like that obviously lean more into sort of like ghost stories rather than specifically mythology and folklore, but if you guys ever want me to look into more of paranormal stuff as well as mythology and that kind of thing, let me know, because I do find it incredibly fascinating and they do make for very good stories. So leave a comment down below if you want me to start looking into more paranormal things as well. Now, the third Conjuring film, titled The Devil Made Me Do It, is slightly different, because this isn't just a case of like a haunting or a possession. It includes a murder trial. It kind of blurs the line between like a paranormal ghost story and like a true crime story. I'm just adding like a few subtle touches of green because I've realized the nun's like makeup, her face isn't pure white. It's just super like mottled skin, and it's almost kind of moldy in a way. So I really want to try and get that aspect down. Believe it or not, this is looking a bit too clean. Now, the timeline for this story is a little bit later on in the career of Ed and Lorraine. It starts in 1980. So, Debbie Glatzel, I think is how it's pronounced, and her fiance, Arne Johnson, move into a rental property in Brookfield, Connecticut. Shortly after they move in, I think it's literally like a few days after they move in when they're like tidying up or trying to sort things out, Debbie's younger brother, 11-year-old David, starts acting strangely. And he then starts making claims of seeing a man with big black eyes who threatens him. Now, the couple actually initially thought that David was using this sort of apparition as a bit of an excuse to try and get out of like helping them and doing various chores, that kind of thing. But David told them that this strange man that he'd seen had actually threatened to harm the couple if they moved into that property. Among David's visions of this like old man, some of them included the man appearing as like this sort of demonic beast who would mutter to him in like Latin and basically threaten to steal his soul. And despite the fact that no one else within the family ever saw this vision of the strange man apart from David, they did start to hear like strange noises coming from the attic. Now, whilst the family had originally tried to sort of brush it off as like an overactive imagination or an excuse to get out chores, that kind of thing, David's symptoms just progressively got worse. He began to experience night terrors, increasingly strange behaviors, unexplained marks, scratches, and bruises began appearing on him, at which point the family called on the services of a Catholic priest who had attempted to bless the house. But at this point, the family kind of concluded that the house was just evil, so they would no longer rent it out to anyone. Now, despite the best efforts of this Catholic priest, David's symptoms continued to get worse, and they started occurring more and more, and his visions began affecting him like during the daytime as well, so it wasn't just limited to these like night terrors. Then 12 days after the original incident is when the Warrens were called in for help, and Lorraine claimed to witness a sort of black mist materialize next to David, which was an indication of a malevolent presence. Now, all the while, David's symptoms had continued to worsen, and it escalated to the point of him like hissing and growling, speaking in like tongues and reciting passages from the Bible and Paradise Lost. The Warrens then concluded that David was actually the victim of multiple possessions, and they ordered for 3 lesser exorcisms to be performed. Now, during these exorcisms, Lorraine claimed that David began like levitating, he stopped breathing for a little while, and even demonstrated the ability of, I think it's precognition? Precognition? Basically this supernatural ability to be able to foresee events in the future. But it was specifically in relation to the murder / manslaughter that would later occur. These are meant to be like blackened veins, but they come out slightly more like cracks. So apparently we're going for more of like a stone look today. Now, during one of these 3 exorcisms, Arne Johnson, so the brother-in-law almost of David, apparently shouts at this demonic spirit, telling it to inhabit him and essentially like leave David alone. And according to the Warrens, that is exactly what happened. So according to some sources, a few days after this alleged transfer took place, Johnson was actually attacked by this demon in the form that this spirit or this force allegedly took control of his car and like forced him off the road into a tree. Now, whilst Johnson himself was unharmed by this incident, at least physically, I can imagine mentally it probably wouldn't do you much good, it led him to go back to the rental property, particularly to investigate a well that was allegedly where the demon sort of was. Later on, Johnson himself would explain that this was his final encounter with this demon while still completely lucid, because as he encountered this demon within the well, he made direct eye contact with it, which allegedly the Warrens had warned him not to do under any circumstances, because he then became fully possessed. After this, a lot of witnesses claimed that Johnson would fall into this like trance-like state where he would hiss and growl and like hallucinate various different things, but he would never have any recollection of it afterwards, and a lot of his behaviours were sort of mirroring what had originally happened with David. Now, on February 16th, 1981, so not even a year after this all started, during an altercation in which both men had been drinking quite heavily, Johnson repeatedly stabbed his landlord, a man named Alan Bono. There were a lot of witnesses to what happened who again reiterated that Johnson seemed really like dazed and kind of out of it, that he was hissing and growling and a lot of all the other behaviours and symptoms that he'd been showing as part of this alleged possession. And again, Johnson would have basically no memory of what happened afterwards. The landlord was taken to the hospital but would eventually die as a result of his injuries, at which point Johnson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Arne Johnson's case is the first case in US history where demonic possession was attempted as a defence. The Warrens attested to this and were actually called in as expert witnesses during the trial, where they confirmed that yes, he was indeed possessed by a demonic spirit when the incident happened, and his lawyer argued not guilty by reason of demonic possession. It's the whole phrase of "the devil made me do it." It's where that came from. Now, obviously, this story was huge. This had never been heard of before, and despite the expert testimony from the Warrens, the judge sort of like immediately rejected this claim, ruling that possession was not a legally valid defence. I saw a little bit more detail into it in that whilst they were claiming demonic possession, the devil made me do it on one hand, they were also claiming that Johnson had acted in self-defence because, as I said, there was a bit of an altercation between the two men. So, obviously, you can't be acting in self-defence if you're claiming that the devil made you do it, because if the devil made you do it, then it's premeditated, it's murder, it's intent, because the devil did it. But if you're acting in self-defense, do you see what I mean? Basically, the judge argued that it can't be self-defense and demonic possession. And obviously self-defense is generally considered a much more viable option in a court of law. As a result, the jury found Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter, and I think he was sentenced with like 10 to 20 years in prison, but he only actually served 5. He was released early on good behaviour, he married Debbie, his fiancée, and sort of lived fairly under the radar ever since. Now, the case and the trial and all the information and details about it absolutely fascinated the media. The tabloids dubbed it the devil made me do it case, and to this day, it remains the only US homicide trial that tried to claim demonic possession as a defense. Now, the final case that we're looking at is the haunting of the Smurl family, which is the case that inspired the latest film. Obviously, if you haven't seen the film, it won't spoil it, but obviously there's going to be a lot of details included in this case that are relevant to the film, so if you haven't seen it yet, you want to, you might want to skip over this bit. Despite it being portrayed as Ed and Lorraine's like last case and the case that made them like retire, it actually began back in 1973. So Jack and Janet Smurl moved into a duplex in West Pitton, Pennsylvania, along with their children and Jack's parents. So there's like 8 of them in this house. There's a lot of people involved. Okay, I went a bit overboard with the mouth, but so, as seems to be kind of the standard with a lot of these stories, it starts out with quite small disturbances, so doors slamming, random banging and knocking, beds shaking, apparitions of like figures and shadowy creatures, that kind of thing. But it escalates quite dramatically and ends up including claims of sexual assault to both Jack and Janet. And obviously this starts in 1973, and it continued for over a decade. Then, in 1986, so 13 years after they first moved into this house and started experiencing all this stuff, that is when they contacted the Warrens. Now, based on their initial sort of report and investigation, Lorraine claims to sense 3 separate spirits: a harmless elderly woman, a troubled young girl, and an incredibly violent man. But beyond those 3, there was a 4th entity, and she believes it was like a powerful demonic spirit that was actually manipulating the 3 other spirits. And Ed himself reported hearing like growls and seeing objects move during their visits as well. Now, the Warrens then performed something called religious provocation, which is where they play hymns and say prayers, that kind of thing, in order to try and like elicit a reaction, a response. And they claimed that as a result of this provocation, loads of like furniture started shaking and moving just like quite violently as well. Now, by the summer of that same year that the Warrens got involved, the case had absolutely exploded across the media. Local and national news were covering the story, neighbours were gathering outside, people were travelling to come and visit and view this allegedly haunted house. There were TV crews reporting live from like right outside their door. Multiple priests were called in to try and like bless the house to be rid of all these different spirits. Although interestingly, there was a priest who was called in who actually spent 2 nights staying in the house with the family, though he reported that he experienced basically nothing while he was there. Now, as with the Enfield poltergeist, many skeptics, including members of the CSIOP, I believe, CSICOP, which is the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. They basically all called the whole thing a hoax, and the Diocese of Scranton refused to label it as demonic. Now, obviously, despite everything that was happening, the Smurls remained in that property up until 1986. Then, a new family moved in, and as we've seen in many cases, reported absolutely no disturbances or strange happenings whatsoever. Though this story of the Smurls' experiences and hauntings lived on through a book released in 1988 called The Haunting, and then later a TV show from 1991. Not TV show, a movie from 1991 called the same. Fast forward to 2025, The Conjuring Last Rites draws very heavily on the Smurl case, but it's presented as one of the Warrens' most like harrowing cases and it's their final case. Right, I am essentially done with this look. I just need to go and add like the outfit and accessories for it. I think I'm procrastinating because I've still got quite a bit to talk about, and I just feel like it's going to be really bizarre to sit here and talk about it with the full look going on. I mean, I say that like I don't look insane right now anyway. Let me just go, finish up, put all the bits on that I need to, and then we can come back to close up. Just a quick side note, I'm aware this is not the most biblically accurate sort of nun, is it a habit that is like the headpiece and everything that I wear? I have very much had to cobble this together with various bits of material and clothing, so yeah. I do have a lovely set of teeth to go with this look, but I do still have quite a lot to talk about, and I can't talk with those teeth in, so they will be going in at the end. So now I get to finish off the rest of the video like this, which honestly, it does feel kind of weird. So we've covered the sort of major cases that inspired all the Conjuring films and a lot of the storylines within the Conjuring universe. Yes, I'm aware the nun Valak demon thing is not one of them. I'll circle back around to that in a second. And obviously there were a lot of other cases that the Warrens investigated or had involvement with, such as the Amityville Horror, which wasn't part of like the main Conjuring universe, but in and of itself is an incredibly famous haunting in general. And I think there are like other films about it. And again, another case that they investigated was I think it's Snedeker, I don't know how it's pronounced. Another family who were haunted in Connecticut, which then inspired the film The Haunting in Connecticut. They're really imaginative with these names. But obviously for the Conjuring franchise and the Conjuring universe, the Perrons, Annabelle, the Enfield poltergeists, Arne Johnson, and the Smurls are like the core of that universe. Now, we've gone through all the real cases, but this is where I could say it gets a little bit meta, which is what if the film sets themselves were in fact haunted? Now, most people will have probably heard of this concept of like the cursed film set before, and like horror movies in particular love this kind of like added layer of lore to them. So Poltergeist, The Exorcist being some of the most famous examples, both of which have very long-standing reputations for like strange accidents or just sort of bad luck. And the Conjuring films, being based on real or allegedly real cases, are no different. Both the cast and crew have shared various stories about weird things happening, some of which do sound like they could be lifted straight out of the script that they're working on to begin with. So we can start with the first film, Conjuring, in 2013. Now, Lorraine Warren, the Lorraine Warren, was still alive when this film was in production, and she served as a consultant on the film, as well as actually having like a brief cameo in it. She told the director, James Wan, that while she supported this project, she did have some reservations and some concerns that like dramatizing the events and what happened could stir up like negative energy or negative forces. The actress who plays Lorraine, I think her name's, is it Vera Farmiga? I'm not entirely sure on its pronunciation. She has said that she felt like a strange energy on the set almost right away. And after finishing some of the initial phone calls about the film, she found these like long claw-like scratches down the screen of her laptop. And allegedly there were 3 of them, which is known as the Trinity Mockery, which within like demonology is considered a very signature insult, which I didn't know that. I didn't know there was like insults in demonology. That was quite fascinating to me, I have to say. Anyone who knows more details about demonology in general, please let me know. It's so interesting. During the filming as well, Vera refused to take any of her scripts home with her. She kept them locked up in her trailer away from her family because she felt there was like a really heavy, dark energy attached to them. Now, the Perron family, like the real life family from the actual case, even visited the set, and I believe it was Andrea Perron, who I think is, if I remember correctly, is the one who wrote the books about it. She said that as soon as they arrived on set, there was this like really strong, really cold gust of wind that like blew through the crew and the set. But people noted that like all the trees around them stayed completely still. This wind only went through the crew and like the set, and it really unnerved people, because especially if it's the actual family who have just arrived and then this weird wind thing happens, because obviously the gust of wind is super strongly associated with like demonology and spirits and ghosts and the paranormal in general. To add like another layer to these possible coincidences, but like spooky coincidences nonetheless, Carolyn Perron, the mother, who had actually stayed home that day that the rest of the family arrived on set, experienced like a really strange accident that happened around the same time, and it resulted in her falling, injuring herself quite badly. As a result, she had to be taken to hospital, and some people have made a connection about like the timing of the family being on set without her. So after the first Conjuring film, then came Annabelle, released in 2016. The director of the film, John R. Leonetti, he said quite early on that just something about the set felt off. Early on in filming as well, a crew member found like really strange markings that had appeared near a window near one of the sets. There was also quite a strange incident that occurred during the filming of a scene set in like an elevator shaft. A substantially heavy lighting rig fell very unexpectedly and sort of crashed into the spot where one of the actors had been standing literally like seconds before. And I think they looked into it and they couldn't necessarily determine like the reason why it had fallen. There wasn't any very obvious like malfunctions or like it hadn't been rigged up properly or anything like that. It just fell. Leonetti, the director, also claimed that during the filming of a hallway scene in which the demon is like dragging one of the characters away, they found things like claw-like fingerprint marks running up the side of a dusty window where no one had actually been near. Even one of the priests who had been called to like bless the set before filming, which was apparently a standard practice within this franchise, said they felt a heaviness during that blessing. By the time The Conjuring 2 came around, which was released the same year as Annabelle, obviously the Conjuring franchise had made quite a bit of a name for itself already, and the cast and the crew were like half joking, half serious about the set being haunted. It became kind of like a running thing. The director, James Wan, who had directed the first Conjuring film, told the press that he and other members of the cast and the crew would hear like unexplained knocking on the walls and like random bursts of static through the radios. And Vera, who plays Lorraine, once again said that she felt targeted by something. After filming some of the more like intense possession scenes, she claimed that she woke up the next day with like unexplained bruising on her arms or like on other parts of her body. The actress who played Janet Hodgson, Madison Wolfe, claimed that she felt quite oppressed by the material that they were covering, though some have argued this could be chalked up to like long, heavy and intense days of filming on set. But some of the biggest, or at least creepiest scares came away from the set. The director recalled that when they were screening like rough cuts of certain possession scenes, various pieces of equipment would just malfunction out of nowhere. There was one instance in particular where like the whole projection system just completely crashed out of nowhere during a scene of demonic activity. And despite it being like a half joking, half serious sort of running theme with these movies, the later films were not immune to these alleged hauntings. During Annabelle Comes Home, the producers bought in the real Annabelle doll, the Raggedy Ann one, though it remained locked up in a case, but they bought it in for like reference. But the crew swore that even without the real doll being on set, the prop versions of the doll did seem to sort of like move subtly when no one was touching them. But I can fully see members of the crew doing that deliberately though. McKenna Grace, the actress who plays the Warrens' daughter Judy, claimed that she experienced recurring nightmares while shooting about the Annabelle doll escaping its case. Even Patrick Wilson, who played Ed Warren and is generally a bit more skeptical about that side of things, even he admitted that the franchise had like a really strange energy, enough to make even sort of non-believers kind of second guess themselves. And to be fair, during all like the press tours for the films, both Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga stated that whilst they weren't necessarily sure if the sets were haunted, they were careful about not like mocking or disrespecting the material that they're working from. They very much treated it like there was the possibility that it could stir something up. And again, I believe I saw, even with the latest film, Vera, again, I think she shared photos of it. After shooting certain scenes, she found like cross-shaped marks appearing on her like arms. I can't remember if they were bruises or scratches, but they were in the shape of a cross. So it begs the question of, were these film sets genuinely haunted? Or is it a case of one of Hollywood's favourite marketing tricks? Because, let's face it, nothing sells a horror film quite like the idea that the set itself is haunted. And, I mean, maybe it's like a bit of both, because cast and crew did report seeing and experiencing things that they just couldn't explain. From equipment malfunctions to eerie, like, scratches, marks. And obviously when you spend months immersed into this, like, world of demonic possession and demonology and cursed objects, it's not too hard to imagine that your brain might start connecting dots that maybe aren't necessarily actually there. Either way, the lore of like the haunted set has become kind of part of the franchise's DNA. Similar again to things like Poltergeist and Exorcist, it's one of the things that gets mentioned about these films, and it really blurs the lines between the original Warren case files and the films that were made about them. But yeah, that's the real Warren case files that inspired what is now a multi-million-dollar horror universe. The question is, were they genuinely encountering the paranormal, or were they just the 20th century's best ghost story marketers? Again, the truth is probably somewhere kind of in the middle. Take a kind of creepy, unexplained experience, exaggerate it a little bit for the media, and then reshape it for the film. As a result, these hauntings and stories, both in the film version and the real-life cases, have gone on to become a kind of modern folklore. And to be honest, whether you believe in them or not, the films do make for some really good Halloween viewing. To be fair, not even specific for Halloween. They are good films. But so brings us to the end of a little, I guess, case study on the Warrens, the Conjuring, and all the cases that blurred the lines between them. I haven't really covered any like classic ghost haunting paranormal stories on here before. Obviously I've lent a lot more into mythology and folklore. Again, if you do want me to look into more stories like this, or even any of these cases but in more detail, leave a comment down below. Let me know as well what your guys' opinion is on stuff like this. What do you think of Ed and Lorraine Warren? Were they genuine? Were they scammers? Were they somewhere in the middle? It's such an interesting topic to debate, because certain stories like this, they divide people so much. Obviously for today's look, I have chosen to embody the demon of Valak, otherwise known as the Nun, an incredibly well-known character from within the Conjuring universe that did get its own spin-off films as well. Now, the character of the nun and the demon is not based on any like real-life Warren cases. This was a character made entirely for film. But I'd already turned myself into Annabelle last year, and I wanted to do like a recognizable character, and I thought this was quite a fun way to sort of represent that blurred line between like media and reality. Maybe, I don't know. I think I just wanted to dress up as the nun, if I'm honest. It's quite a fun makeup to try and do. Because, side note, the actress who played the nun, like, if you see her without all the makeup and stuff, she has such a striking face. Like, honestly, I think she's absolutely stunning in a very kind of ethereal way, almost. Like, oh, her face is just so interesting, and it is stunning to me. Anyway, I got massively sidetracked there. Leave a comment down below, let me know what you think of the lore, let me know what you think of the look. Huge shout out, as always, to my Patreons for helping support my channel and just helping me shape this kind of content for you guys. If you want to get involved in it and see behind the scenes stuff, link in the description. Don't forget to follow me on all of my other social media, especially for October, so that you don't miss any of the other spooky goodness that I am uploading literally every day. So Instagram, TikTok, I mean Spotify and Patreon as well, I guess. Again, all linked in the description down below. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulously spooky day. I hate myself for saying that. I hope you all have a good day. I love and appreciate all of you very, very much. And I will see you all in the... Oh, no, wait. Hold on. Oh my god, that was so dumb. I literally can't talk these in. I hope you all have a fabulous day. I love and appreciate all of you very, very much. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.